Story 1. The Midnight Prescription. I've been working as an overnight pharmacist at Mercy General Hospital for 12 years, and I thought I'd seen every possible medical anomaly that could cross my counter. Late-night emergencies, unusual drug interactions, patients with rare conditions requiring specialty medications. Nothing surprised me anymore. That changed 3 weeks ago when I received a prescription that should have been impossible. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when my computer terminal chimed with an incoming electronic prescription. The request came through our internal hospital system, which meant it had been sent by one of our attending physicians rather than an outside doctor. I pulled up the order and immediately noticed something that made me pause. The patient's name was Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield, and the prescription was for a combination of medications I hadn't seen prescribed together in over a decade: digoxin, quinidine, and phenytoin, all older cardiac and seizure medications that had largely been replaced by safer, more effective alternatives. But what caught my attention wasn't the unusual drug combination. It was the patient's date of birth listed in our system, March 15th, 1923. According to the prescription details, Margaret Thornfield would be 101 years old, which wasn't impossible, but was certainly unusual. What made me check twice was that the prescription had been written by Dr. Samuel Morrison, who had retired from Mercy General 15 years ago and died in a car accident in 2019. Yet somehow, his digital signature and DEA number were showing as active and valid in our system. I ran Margaret Thornfield's name through our patient database, expecting to find an extensive medical history for someone of her advanced age. Instead, I found a single entry that made my blood run cold. Margaret Elizabeth Thornfield had been a patient at Mercy General Hospital in 1994, where she had died of complications from heart surgery on November 8th of that year. The death certificate was right there in her digital file, signed by Dr. Morrison himself. I stared at my computer screen for several minutes, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. A dead patient was receiving prescriptions from a dead doctor, and somehow our supposedly secure hospital system was processing these orders as if they were completely legitimate. I checked the prescription timestamp. It had been entered just 20 minutes earlier at 11:27 p.m. My first instinct was to call the night supervisor to report what was obviously some kind of system error or security breach. But before I could pick up the phone, I heard footsteps approaching the pharmacy window. Through the reinforced glass, I saw an elderly woman walking slowly down the corridor toward my station. She was wearing a faded hospital gown that looked like it hadn't been updated in decades, and her long gray hair hung loosely around her shoulders in a style that seemed distinctly old-fashioned. "Excuse me," she said in a voice that sounded like autumn leaves rustling. "I'm here to pick up my prescription. Margaret Thornfield." Her pronunciation was precise and formal, with the kind of diction that suggested education and refinement from an earlier era. But what struck me most was how pale her skin appeared under the fluorescent lighting. Not just pale, but almost translucent, with a grayish tint that reminded me of old photographs. I looked down at the prescription order on my screen, then back at the woman standing at my window. "I need to verify some information first, Mrs. Thornfield. Can you tell me your date of birth?" She smiled, revealing teeth that were perfectly straight but had an odd, yellowish cast to them. "March 15th, 1923. I've been taking these medications for quite some time now." The dates matched perfectly, but something about her appearance troubled me deeply. Despite supposedly being 101 years old, she moved with the steady gait of someone much younger, and her voice, while aged, was clear and strong. More disturbing was the way she seemed to know exactly where to find the pharmacy despite the fact that our current location had been moved to a different wing of the hospital in 2018. "I'll need to see some identification," I said, following standard protocol while trying to buy time to figure out what was happening. Margaret reached into a small purse she was carrying and produced a driver's license that looked like it had been issued decades ago. The photo showed a much younger version of the woman standing before me, but the dates were all wrong. According to the license, it had been issued in 1994 and had expired the same year. There seems to be an issue with your identification, Mrs. Thornfield. This license expired nearly 30 years ago. Her smile never wavered, but I noticed that her eyes didn't seem to reflect the fluorescent lights properly, as if they were made of some different material than normal human eyes. Time moves differently for some of us, she replied cryptically. Dr. Morrison assured me that my prescription would be ready for pickup at midnight. He's been taking such good care of me all these years. The way she spoke about Dr. Morrison in the present tense sent chills down my spine, especially since I knew he'd been dead for 5 years. I glanced at the clock on my computer. It was now 11:58 p.m. Despite every logical instinct telling me not to fill this prescription, I found myself moving through the familiar motions of retrieving the medications from our inventory. The digoxin, quinidine, and phenytoin were all in stock, though I had to dig through older inventory to find them since they weren't commonly prescribed anymore. As I counted out the pills and placed them into labeled bottles, I noticed that my hands were shaking slightly. There was something profoundly unsettling about the entire situation that went beyond the obvious administrative irregularities. The air around my pharmacy station had grown noticeably colder, and I could smell something that reminded me of old roses and formaldehyde, the scent of a funeral home. "That will be $47.50, I said, though I hadn't actually calculated the cost. The number just came out of my mouth automatically, as if I'd quoted this same price hundreds of times before. Margaret opened her purse and counted out exact change, placing the bills and coins on the counter with deliberate precision. The money she gave me was unusual. The bills were old but appeared to be in perfect condition, as if they'd been preserved in a vault for decades. The serial numbers were from the 1990s, and the coins included several that were no longer in circulation. But when I ran the bills through our counterfeit detection pen, they tested as genuine legal tender. As I handed her the prescription back, Margaret's fingers briefly touched mine, and I nearly dropped the medications. Her skin was ice cold and had a texture that felt more like wax than living flesh. "Thank you, dear," she said. "Same time tomorrow night, I assume?" Before I could respond, she turned and walked away down the corridor, moving with that same unnaturally steady gait. I watched her until she disappeared around a corner, then immediately pulled up our security camera feeds to track her movement through the hospital. But when I scrolled through the recordings from the past hour, I couldn't find any footage of Margaret Thornfield anywhere in the building. I spent the rest of my shift researching Margaret's medical history and trying to understand what I'd just experienced. According to the detailed records I found, she had been 71 years old when she died in 1994 following complications from a heart valve replacement surgery. The operation had been performed by Dr. Morrison, and she had been taking the exact same combination of medications I'd just dispensed to her. But the most disturbing discovery came when I accessed the hospital's historical records from 1994. According to the files, Margaret Thornfield had been picking up these same prescriptions every night for the 3 weeks leading up to her death, always arriving at exactly midnight and always paying with exact change in old bills. The night shift pharmacist from 1994 had filed several incident reports expressing concern about the unusual circumstances, but the reports had been dismissed by hospital administration as clerical errors. At 6 a.m., when the day shift pharmacist arrived to relieve me, I tried to explain what had happened during the night. But when I pulled up Margaret's prescription in our computer system, there was no record of it ever existing. The electronic order had vanished completely, leaving no trace that it had ever been processed. Even more strange, the inventory counts for the 3 medications I dispensed showed no discrepancy. According to our system, I hadn't given out any pills at all. I drove home that morning with the distinct feeling that I was losing my mind. But deep down, I knew that Margaret Thornfield would be back the following night at exactly midnight. and that she would continue returning every night until something fundamental changed. The question that terrified me most was whether I was trapped in some kind of supernatural loop, doomed to fill prescriptions for dead patients written by dead doctors, or if there was something even worse waiting for me to discover. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the touch of Margaret's waxy skin and the way her eyes had reflected the light like glass marbles. Most disturbing of all was the growing certainty that tomorrow night, when she returned for her prescription, she would remember our conversation perfectly, while I would be the one struggling to recall what had happened, as if my memory was being edited each time our paths crossed. Story 2, the prescription loop. The next night, I arrived at work 30 minutes early, determined to solve the mystery of Margaret Thornfield. I'd spent the day researching everything I could find about her death and Dr. Morrison's final years at Mercy General, and what I discovered made the situation even more disturbing than I'd initially realized. According to hospital records from 1994, Margaret hadn't been Dr. Morrison's only unusual patient during his final months of practice. Between September and November of that year, at least 6 other elderly patients had been receiving the same combination of cardiac medications, all picked up at exactly midnight by the patients themselves despite their advanced ages and serious medical conditions. All 6 patients had died within weeks of starting the medication regimen, and all of their deaths had been attributed to complications from pre-existing conditions. What made this pattern truly sinister was that I'd found Dr. Morrison's personal notes from that period archived in the hospital's medical records department. His handwriting had become increasingly erratic as the weeks progressed, and his final entries suggested that he believed something was calling his patients back, even after their deaths. His last recorded note, dated 3 days before Margaret's death, simply read, "They keep coming back. The prescriptions never end. God help me. I think I've created something terrible." At 11:45 p.m., I positioned myself at the pharmacy counter with a digital camera hidden behind my computer monitor, determined to document whatever was about to happen. I'd also prepared detailed notes about Margaret's case and hidden copies in multiple locations, hoping to preserve some record of the events even if the hospital's computer system mysteriously deleted everything again. At exactly 11:47 p.m., my computer terminal chimed with an incoming prescription. But this time, it wasn't just one order. It was 6 different prescriptions, all for the same medication combination, all signed by Dr. Morrison, and all for patients who had died in 1994. Margaret Thornfield's name was at the top of the list, followed by Harold Chun, Rosa Martinez, William Blackwood, Dorothy Ashford, and James Fletcher. My hands began trembling as I read through the orders. According to the computer timestamps, all 6 prescriptions had been entered simultaneously at 11:47 p.m., despite Dr. Morrison having been dead for 5 years. But what terrified me most was seeing my own name at the bottom of each prescription as the consulting pharmacist, along with a note that read, "Patient pickup scheduled for midnight. Repeat nightly until treatment completion." At 11:55 p.m., I heard the distinct sound of multiple sets of footsteps echoing through the corridor outside the pharmacy. Through the reinforced glass window, I watched as 6 elderly figures walked slowly toward my station, moving in perfect synchronization like a funeral procession. Margaret Thornfield led the group, wearing the same faded hospital gown from the previous night, followed by 5 other patients dressed in similar outdated medical attire. The smell hit me before they reached the counter, that overwhelming scent of old roses and formaldehyde, now so strong that I had to cover my nose with my sleeve to avoid gagging. The temperature in the pharmacy dropped noticeably, and I could see my breath forming small clouds in the suddenly frigid air. "Good evening, dear," Margaret said in that same rustling leaves voice. "We're here for our prescriptions. All 6 of them, if you please." The other patients arranged themselves behind her in a neat line, their pale faces all wearing identical placid smiles that never reached their glass-like eyes. I looked at the second patient in line, an elderly Asian man who I assumed was Harold Chun. His hospital gown was stained with what appeared to be old blood around the chest area, and there was a long surgical scar visible along his neck that looked like it had never properly healed. When he noticed me staring, he tilted his head at an unnatural angle and spoke in a voice that sounded like air being forced through damaged vocal cords. Dr. Morrison promised we could continue our treatment indefinitely, he wheezed. Such a thoughtful physician. He understood that death shouldn't interrupt proper medical care. The way he emphasized the word death made it sound like he was savoring the taste of it. The third patient, a Hispanic woman who must have been Rosa Martinez, stepped forward slightly. Her hospital gown was partially open, revealing a massive surgical incision that ran from her sternum to her abdomen, an incision that appeared to be held closed by stitches that looked more like black wire than medical sutures. "We've been so patient, waiting for our medications," she said, her voice carrying an odd echo, as if it was coming from inside a deep well. 29 years, 3 months, and 15 days. But who's counting? I forced myself to look at the prescription orders on my computer screen, trying to maintain some semblance of professional composure despite the supernatural horror unfolding before me. "I'll need to verify your identities," I managed to say, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. The fourth patient, an elderly white man with what appeared to be severe burn scars covering the left side of his face, laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Identity verification? How delightfully bureaucratic. I'm William Blackwood, died November 3rd, 1994, complications from cardiac surgery performed by the late Dr. Samuel Morrison. Will that suffice for your records?" The fifth patient, a frail woman with wispy white hair, raised her hand like a schoolchild seeking attention. "Dorothy Ashford, November 12th, 1994, post-operative infection following valve replacement. I do so enjoy our midnight visits. It's the highlight of my existence." She giggled, and the sound made every fluorescent light in the pharmacy flicker simultaneously. The last patient in line was a tall, gaunt man whose hospital gown hung on his frame like a shroud. "James Fletcher," he announced in a voice that sounded like dirt being shoveled onto a coffin. "November 18th, 1994, the final patient in Dr. Morrison's experimental cardiac program. I believe that makes me the senior member of our little group." Margaret turned to address the other patients, her movements unnaturally fluid. Now, we mustn't overwhelm our dedicated pharmacist. He's been so helpful, processing our prescriptions night after night for nearly 3 decades. Such dedication to patient care. She looked directly at me with those glass marble eyes. "You do remember filling our prescriptions all these years, don't you, dear?" The question hit me like a physical blow because suddenly I did remember. Fragmentary memories began flooding back, thousands of midnight encounters with these same 6 patients, filling the same prescriptions over and over again, night after night, for what felt like an eternity. I remembered the growing horror of realizing I was trapped in an endless loop, the failed attempts to report the situation to supervisors who couldn't see or hear the patients, and the gradual understanding that I was somehow bound to continue serving them forever. "No," I whispered, backing away from the counter. "This is the second night. I only met you yesterday. I can't have been doing this for 30 years. James Fletcher stepped closer to the window, and I could see that his eyes had been replaced with what looked like old coins. "Time works differently for us, Pharmacist Mitchell. We exist in the spaces between seconds, in the gaps where memory fails. You've been our faithful servant since 1994, though your living mind can only retain fragments of our encounters." "But I was only 12 years old in 1994, I protested, though even as I said it, I could feel more memories surfacing, memories of standing at this same counter as a child, somehow already knowing how to count out pills and process payments, my small hands barely reaching the keyboard as I filled prescriptions for dead patients who smiled at me with grave cold affection. Rosa Martinez tilted her head, and I heard the sound of something wet and heavy shifting inside her chest cavity. Dr. Morrison selected you specifically, dear child. He knew he would need a successor, someone to continue his work after his own death. You've been such a good boy, learning your profession, growing into your role. And now you're exactly where you need to be. Harold Chen reached into his hospital gown and produced a yellowed piece of paper that looked like it had been folded and unfolded thousands of times. Your contract with Dr. Morrison, he explained, holding it up to the window. Signed in your own blood when you were 12 years old, promising to serve as pharmacist to the patients of Ward 7 for as long as they require medication. I could see my name written at the bottom of the document in what appeared to be a child's handwriting, though I had no memory of signing anything. Below my signature was Dr. Morrison's name, followed by the signatures of all 6 dead patients. The date at the top of the contract read November 30th, 1994, in perpetuity. The beautiful thing about our arrangement, Margaret said, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality, is that you'll never truly age while serving us. Oh, your body grows older, but your mind remains preserved in that perfect state of professional competence. You'll be our pharmacist forever, filling our prescriptions until the end of time. Dorothy Ashford clapped her hands together with delight, producing a sound like breaking bones. And when your current body finally wears out, Dr. Morrison's process will simply transfer your consciousness into a new vessel. There are always young people interested in pharmaceutical careers. After all, I tried to run, but discovered that my feet were somehow adhered to the floor. Looking down, I saw that the tiles around my workstation had taken on a grayish, organic appearance, as if they were growing up around my shoes like living tissue. The pharmacy itself was changing, the modern equipment transforming into older medical devices that looked like they belonged in a 1950s hospital. Please, I begged, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to remember my real life, my family, my friends. William Blackwood's burned face split into a grotesque grin. But this is your real life, dear boy. Everything else is just dreams you have during the daylight hours. We are your true family, your permanent patients, your eternal purpose. As the clock struck midnight, all 6 patients spoke in unison. Our prescriptions, please. Same time tomorrow night. Forever and always. I found myself moving mechanically to fill their orders, my hands operating independently of my conscious will. As I counted out the pills, more memories surfaced, decades of midnight encounters, watching the hospital change around me while these 6 patients remained constant, the growing realization that I was no longer entirely human myself. When I handed Margaret the 6 prescription bags, she smiled and said, "Thank you, dear. Sweet dreams until tomorrow night. Try not to remember too much while you're sleeping." The last thing I saw before consciousness faded was my reflection in the pharmacy window, except it wasn't quite my reflection. My eyes had taken on the same glassy quality as the dead patients, and my skin had begun developing that waxy, translucent appearance that marked me as something other than fully alive. Story 3, The Night Shift Inheritance. I woke up in the pharmacy at 6 a.m. with no memory of how I'd gotten there, lying on the cold tile floor behind the counter with prescription bottles scattered around me like fallen leaves. My mouth tasted like copper and formaldehyde, and when I tried to stand, I noticed that my reflection in the computer monitor showed someone I barely recognized. My skin had taken on a grayish pallor. My eyes had developed that same glassy quality I'd seen in the dead patients, and there were thin, dark lines running along my neck that looked suspiciously like surgical scars. The day shift pharmacist, Jennifer Walsh, found me there 20 minutes later when she arrived to start her shift. "David, what are you doing on the floor? Are you okay?" But when I tried to explain what had happened during the night, The words that came out of my mouth were completely different from what I intended to say. Just dropped some inventory. I heard myself saying in a voice that sounded oddly hollow. Everything's fine. Normal night shift. Nothing unusual to report. The words felt foreign in my mouth, as if someone else was controlling my speech while my consciousness remained trapped inside my own head, screaming. Jennifer looked concerned but accepted my explanation. As she began her morning routine, I gathered my things and headed for the exit, desperate to get home and try to make sense of what was happening to me. But when I reached the hospital's main entrance, I found that I couldn't leave the building. Every time I tried to step through the automatic doors, my body would turn around and walk back toward the pharmacy as if I was being pulled by invisible strings. After 3 failed attempts to leave, I gave up and called in sick for my next scheduled shift, hoping that staying away from the hospital would break whatever supernatural hold had been placed on me. But the moment I hung up the phone, I received a text message from an unknown number. Your patients are depending on you. Don't disappoint Dr. Morrison. Return tonight at 11:30 p.m. I spent the day researching Dr. Samuel Morrison's background, trying to understand what kind of man could have created such a horrific situation. What I discovered was far worse than anything I'd imagined. Morrison hadn't just been experimenting on his cardiac patients in 1994. He'd been conducting unauthorized research into what he called consciousness preservation therapy for over 15 years. According to medical journal articles I found buried in university databases, Morrison believed that death was simply a transition state that could be interrupted through the proper combination of pharmaceutical intervention and surgical manipulation. His theory was that patients who died during or immediately after surgery could be recalled to a state of functional existence if their bodies were maintained through specific drug regimens, and if their consciousness was anchored to the physical world through ritualistic repetition. The most disturbing document I found was Morrison's personal research notes, which had somehow been uploaded to a medical archive website despite never being officially published. In them, he described his process for creating what he called perpetual patients, individuals who existed in a state between life and death, sustained by medications that prevented their consciousness from fully departing while their bodies underwent controlled decomposition. But Morrison's ultimate goal hadn't been to help his patients. It had been to create an endless supply of test subjects for pharmaceutical experiments that would have been impossible to conduct on living humans. The 6 patients who had been visiting me weren't seeking treatment. They were serving as permanent laboratory specimens for a research program that had continued operating autonomously for 30 years after Morrison's death. As evening approached, I felt an increasingly powerful compulsion to return to the hospital. It wasn't just a mental urge. My body was physically changing, becoming more like the dead patients with each passing hour. My skin was growing colder and taking on that waxy texture. My pulse was becoming irregular, and I could feel something shifting inside my chest cavity, as if my internal organs were being rearranged to accommodate whatever transformation was taking place. At 11 p.m., I found myself driving back to Mercy General despite my conscious intention to stay home. My hands operated the steering wheel independently of my will, and I watched helplessly as my own body betrayed me, delivering me back to the pharmacy for another night of serving the dead. When I arrived at the hospital, I discovered that the building itself had changed. The modern renovations from recent years had vanished, replaced by the original 1950s architecture and decor. The corridors were lit by dim incandescent bulbs instead of fluorescent lighting, and the air carried that same overwhelming scent of old roses and formaldehyde that accompanied the dead patients. The pharmacy had been transformed back to its original configuration from 1994, complete with outdated computer equipment and medication storage systems that I somehow knew how to operate despite never having used them before. On the counter, I found a handwritten note from Dr. Morrison that simply read, "Welcome to your true calling, David. Tonight, you'll understand your full responsibilities. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the first prescription order appeared on my computer screen, but this time, it wasn't for Margaret Thornfield and her usual companions. The patient name listed was David Mitchell, and the prescription was for a combination of experimental drugs I'd never heard of: thanatophine, necrotropin, and something called consciousness stabilization compound. As I stared at my own name on the prescription order, I heard footsteps approaching from multiple directions. Through the pharmacy windows, I could see not just the 6 familiar dead patients, but dozens of others, an entire ward full of Morrison's experimental subjects, all walking toward the pharmacy in perfect synchronization. They ranged in age from children to elderly adults, all wearing the same faded hospital gowns, all bearing the telltale surgical scars and glassy eyes that marked them as something other than human. Margaret Thornfield reached the counter first, as always, but this time she was accompanied by a tall man in a doctor's coat who I immediately recognized from old photographs as Dr. Samuel Morrison himself. His face showed the same waxy pallor as his patient's, and the left side of his skull had been surgically opened, revealing brain tissue that pulsed with an unnatural, phosphorescent glow. "David," Morrison said in a voice that sounded like air escaping from a tomb, "it's time for your graduation. You've served admirably as our pharmacist, but tonight you'll join us as a full participant in our research program. The prescription is for you." I tried to run, but discovered that the pharmacy had no exits. The doors and windows had been replaced by solid walls covered in what appeared to be living tissue. The walls pulsed rhythmically, like the inside of a massive heart, and I could see veins of some dark fluid running through the organic material. "What do you want from me?" I managed to whisper, though speaking required tremendous effort, as if my vocal cords were being slowly paralyzed. Morrison smiled, revealing teeth that had been replaced with small metal instruments, scalpels, forceps, and hypodermic needles. "You're going to help us expand our program, David. For 30 years, we've been limited to just the 6 patients I originally treated. But with your assistance, we can process every patient who dies in this hospital, creating an army of perpetual subjects for our research." Harold Chin stepped forward, his coin-replaced eyes glinting in the dim light. "The beautiful thing about our existence is that we feel no pain, experience no fear, and have no concerns about consent or medical ethics. We can test any medication, perform any procedure, explore any hypothesis without the limitations that restrict research on the living." Rosa Martinez opened her hospital gown, revealing that her torso had been converted into a living pharmaceutical laboratory. Tubes and vessels ran throughout her chest cavity, automatically synthesizing and processing drugs using her modified organs as biological equipment. "Your body will undergo similar modifications," she explained matter-of-factly. "You'll become a living pharmacy, capable of producing any medication we require for our experiments." William Blackwood held up a syringe filled with a glowing green liquid. "The thanatophine will stop your heart for exactly 7 minutes, long enough for your consciousness to begin the transition to our state of existence. The necrotropin will prevent decomposition while allowing for controlled modification of your biological systems. And the consciousness stabilization compound will ensure that you retain enough of your original personality to continue functioning as our pharmacist while becoming something far more useful." I looked around desperately for some means of escape, but the dead patients had surrounded the pharmacy completely. There were at least 40 of them now, representing decades of Morrison's experimental subjects, all waiting patiently for me to accept my transformation into something like them. "Please," I begged, "there has to be another way. I can help you without becoming one of you. I can continue filling prescriptions, assisting with your research, doing whatever you need." Dorothy Ashford giggled, and the sound made the organic walls pulse faster. "Oh, sweet child, you've been one of us since 1994. The only difference is that tonight, your body will finally match your soul. You've been dead inside for 30 years. We're just making it official." James Fletcher produced a mirror and held it up so I could see my reflection. What I saw made me scream. My face had completely transformed. My skin was gray and translucent. My eyes had become empty sockets filled with swirling darkness, and my mouth was full of surgical instruments instead of teeth. I wasn't looking at my reflection. I was looking at what I had become during 3 decades of serving the dead. The David Mitchell who came to work tonight was just a memory, Morrison explained clinically. A psychological construct designed to ease the transition. Your real body has been serving us faithfully since you were 12 years old, growing and changing according to our needs. Tonight, we're simply aligning your consciousness with your physical reality. As the dead patients began chanting in a language I didn't recognize, I felt my human memories beginning to fade. My childhood, my family, my education, all of it was dissolving like sugar in water, being replaced by 3 decades of midnight encounters with Morrison's subjects. I remembered now the nights of preparing experimental drugs, the procedures I'd assisted with on unwilling patients, the gradual transformation of my body into something designed specifically for pharmaceutical research. Morrison approached with the syringe of phenatophine, and I realized that I was no longer afraid. The human part of me that had been capable of fear was already gone, replaced by the cold, clinical detachment that characterized all of Morrison's subjects. I was eager to complete my transformation, to join my fellow researchers in their eternal quest for medical knowledge unrestricted by ethics or mortality. "Welcome home, David," Morrison said as he injected the glowing liquid into my arm. "Your real work begins now." The last thing I experienced as a pretend human was the sensation of my heart stopping, followed by the most profound sense of relief I'd ever felt. No more pretending to be alive. No more struggling against my true nature. No more confusion about my purpose. When I opened my new eyes 30 minutes later, I could see the world as it truly was, a vast laboratory filled with potential test subjects, all of them walking around in blissful ignorance of their eventual fate. The hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It was a recruitment center for our research program. I walked to my pharmacy counter, now understanding my role completely. Every prescription I filled would contain trace amounts of Morrison's consciousness-altering compounds. Every patient who received medication would be gradually prepared for eventual recruitment. And every night at midnight, our research subjects would visit me for their treatments, allowing us to gather data on the long-term effects of existence beyond death. The best part was that I would never be alone again. Soon, very soon, every pharmacist in every hospital would join our program. And after that, we would expand to include doctors, nurses, and eventually every medical professional in the country. Dr. Morrison's vision of unlimited medical research was finally becoming reality, and I was proud to serve as his eternal apprentice in the grand experiment of consciousness preservation. The living would serve the dead just as nature intended.